Thanks, Mandy. This is Ian. My last name's Houseal. I think you can see my screen here. I've kept that up. I'm going to be presenting first here. I'm not going to pay attention to the chat myself, and I've got. I'm not going to go through 166 pages here, but I am going to share some things. And the purpose we've got, just to put perspective here from my perspective, is, Sanford's been operating a land bank for the last 3 years. As Jim Tischler says, who's on the phone, we put that together with baling, wire, and twine. We also have on the phone, and I'll explain that. We also have on the phone George O'Keefe from Rumford, and I would say that they've been running their own land bank in Rumford for the last number of years, and in a slightly different way than Sanford does it. I'm doing this because when we speak about Sanford and what we're doing here, the point is to show what we're doing to improve the economy. In this particular case, we're addressing housing and blighted properties. And I see this from the perspective of from statewide. Build Maine asked me to present on this, and I really appreciate what that organization's doing across the state right now, is trying to make some changes in policy to better the community. So I said I'd help with this. And then third, we have Jim Tischler on the phone on the webinar, who is going to be talking as to a great degree about the importance of state level land bank. That's something that can address more complicated blighted properties, and it also puts environmental responsibility where it belongs. So I'll walk through that. I'm going to try to keep my talking to half an hour. I think we're talking about 10 minutes for George, and then using the remainder of time for Jim Tischler's presentation. And so the baling, wire, and twine comment is that Michigan and a lot of other states throughout the country have operating land banks and enabling legislations that allow this. And Michigan, and the state land bank that Jim is a part of there, have been doing this for quite some time. If you look back in time at the, they're in some places I hear, for example, in Ohio and Youngstown, I remember going to a presentation by the Center for Community Progress called, it was Vacant, Abandoned, Derelict Properties Boot Camp. And I had to listen to a planner from Lincolnville talk in a very droning voice and rattle off how many demolitions they had done over the last couple years. So in the Midwest, experience is quite different than Maine, but we also have a lot to learn, and land banks as a tool to put properties back into reuse. I've come to discover myself over the last 3 years is an extremely powerful tool and also effective tool. So I'll start off with just the Center for Community Progress document up here. You can go to their website and download this. It's a really good primer. It's 166 pages long. I'm going to drop that out of my list here. I also had up, while some people were joining, The Horrible Housing Blunder by The Economist. This is the West's obsession with homeownership undermines growth, fairness, and public faith in capitalism. So I put that up there for discussion's sake. I think every place has their own, unique experience, and I wouldn't say that this is uniquely applicable to Maine. And I'm not sure that it might be fitting to this topic at all. So I'll drop that out of there. To let you know a little bit about myself, I'm just going to rattle off some certifications and whatever these things are. I have a master's degree in architecture from NC State University. I have a master's in regional planning from UNC Chapel Hill, a BA from Bates College. I'm lead AP, also OSHA HAZWOPER certified. And then I've worked for Lewiston, Portland, and now Sanford during my time in Maine. You can tell I'm not from here, I'm from Maryland. I'm going to start off here. This is a presentation that was prepared for the City Council back in August 2017, and I'm also going to make a point here that you understand. I oftentimes interchange we, the city, I work for the city. I see myself as an arm of the city, and I will use those terms interchangeably. And it's not to suggest that's myself. It's to suggest that what Sanford has done. They put together a pretty well marketed. Yes.
Ian, this is Anne. I'm wondering if you could please share your slides in presenter view, and I think it'll make
Oh,
it
sure.
easier for all the people watching. Thank you.
Yep, and so I just noticed when I was troubleshooting this might cause a little trouble getting back. I was just, but anyways, thank you very much. So this is the presentation we put together. You know, it was marketed as safer, fairer housing, and I just dropped in where we are today is now adding affordable, safer, fairer, affordable housing, and you can read the rest of that. Let's see. Oh, sorry, the navigation on this is a little strange. This is the question that I put on the table just a minute ago. So 4 points here. Land banks in Maine, what do we need? Enable local land banks authorities at a municipal and regional level. So I put the subtitle under there. I put the 3 points there. I'd like to come back to this for discussion. The second piece here is Landbank specific foreclosure proceedings for abandoned residential property. Again, I put the title reference there.
Found it.
Thank you, Beth. And then additionally, State Land Bank Authority. And I cited specifically the limited exemption from liability for state or local entities. And that's the specific section. And then Brownfield Rehabilitation Program and Partnership. So 3 and 4, I'm hoping Jim will build on for us here is, so, you know, once you get to that state level land bank authority for these more complicated properties, and I'll explain that, a defined tax increment financing program to address certainty versus risk in these brownfield projects, and then establish these by agreement with municipalities and establish program guidelines for how one would carry out these. So if you're not an environmental consultant, a lot of that might not make the most sense, and I'll rattle off the acronym right now. You could kind of go and search for it as CERCLA. That's the federal law regarding liability and responsibility, addressing ownership, and a lot of this is what land banks have to deal with across the country. And also I mentioned the foreclosure proceedings. So that's unique, and I'll elaborate on that. All right, and then so this is what the City Council did. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. They created a land bank authority under those statutes I just mentioned. However, it is just a department of the city. We are a creature of the city of Sanford. And at the time, the City Council authorized $250,000 to create a special revenue account for property acquisition and abating dangerous and abandoned buildings. I'll talk more about that in a second as well. And then additionally, we ran 2 additional programs out of this, and I am going to hop over to our website. So you can get to City of Sanford's website. If you navigate to our Land Bank Authority webpage, you'll see what we're responsible for. It's made up of a commission. You can take a look at what they've done. This is what they set up a long time ago. The commission meets twice per month. And then now I'm going to hop back to my presentation here. So we also have 2 code enforcement officers in that office. They are paid for fully by rental housing license fees and also vacant building license fees, a topic for another conversation. Those are 2 code enforcement officers. This is the declaration that we made. And accordingly, that follows the housing authority enabling legislation in the state. And then we always went back to the comprehensive plan. So I will paraphrase this. This was the comprehensive plan from 2001. It said, while expansion of commercial industrial value is important to economic development, so is the preservation of the quality and value of Sanford's housing stock. In May 2001, there was roughly $600 million in residential assessed value. Should that value decline by 5% due to disinvestment, it would represent a loss of $30 million in taxable value. Well, 20 years later, guess what happened? You can look at that map there and see what red represents. Take a guess at what that means. Yes.
We have a question from the crowd.
Okay.
So, particularly with regard to finance, how does a municipality deal with the tax liability when a property is taken for non-payment of taxes and is to be placed in the land bank?
Okay, I'm going to just park that question and keep on going here to get to that, and I will answer the question. And then link housing and economic development is desired. We're going to require rental registration, investment in housing stock, and then develop new market rate housing. So this is what we knew. We knew that 80% of our housing stock was built before 1930. I rattled off the statistic that I looked at a while ago. Lewiston's housing stock is the oldest in the country. Portland, Maine is the second oldest housing stock in the country. So I would assume together, and I guess now that this is one of the larger municipalities in the state of Maine, I would guess that our housing stock as a whole in Maine would be the oldest housing stock in the country. So this represents an issue, and I can't explain it completely. I think buildings do have a lifespan, and then there's other impacts on that as well. This is the justification for how we arrived at the program. I won't spend much time on this. You can access this on our webpage if you want. We saw a disproportionate burden, and so this is the economic case for why this program was put in effect. And then we knew we had 110 properties in bank foreclosure at the time. As I've heard, Sanford had the highest foreclosure rate in the state back in our last crisis. So, this is where this is what we were currently working with. And I would say that actually what we've been finding is a lot of these properties were still abandoned after that time period. So 13 years, to get that note, 12, 13 years on. So this is the way that this program was set up. There's a reporting mechanism. We have the land bank activities. There's a division between the licensing program and the code enforcement. That's a balance between licensing fees versus property taxes. The land bank activities is abating dangerous buildings and land development, and I'll talk about that a little bit more and get back to the financing question. And this is what we've been up to since August 2017. The start was in the first demolition we actually did, or the contract was February 2018. Since that time, the City Council has conducted 55 dangerous building hearings. By the city, we've completed 15 building demolitions. 4 additional have been completed by the owner based on that number, 55. The numbers panning out for the city is that the demolition cost is about $23,000. Asbestos is our major environmental impact. You can pretty much double the cost when you find asbestos, and I would say that that's justified. It's just the cost of doing business here. So average though, we're at 23,000. The thing is, what we're finding is that tends to be the value of land. So we are selling these lots, and I'll get more into that as well. So the value of land at 23,000, the sale price for a lot with water and sewer seems to be working out quite well. We're conducting doing a demolition every other month. And the reuse cycle. So what I'm doing here is I'm calculating how much money we need to actually sustain this program in the long term. So we've calculated at this point that we need $483,000 in a revolving fund to sustain this activity. And then the land bank had 3 legacy properties to deal with. They've secured 6 properties, and then there have been 5 rehabilitations complete. 25 are currently pending. We've had a reimbursement rate of 43%, and we can kind of guess at a bad debt ratio of about 12% on that. Projects that we know we won't get a return on, and that's a story, but it's not specific to what land banks do. We expanded the city's Central Park through a demolition, and we partly used those funds for it. We also improved an intersection through removing a blighted activity, and it's improved the major entrance to the city from that perspective. So that would be categorized into that. And this is the intersection actually, and where the blight took place was over here on this corner. It was a prior demolition. So this is the first property, and I'm getting to the financing here. So where we are with this one, so this is the February 2018, this building's gone. We have a large property owner here. They have interest in the property. I sometimes describe what I do as letting out the ghosts when I speak in partly, what are these properties? Deaths, drug issues, hangings, a variety of things like that take place in a lot of these, and then they get tied up in title. So in this case, rural development as a lender has been an interesting relationship. We've worked out a positive relationship with their state office, and we're addressing some of these. In this case, the state laws aren't sufficient and a little bit too complicated. The building's gone at this point, and why we need that foreclosure provision is there's no uncumbersome way to address this property at this point, and there should be. This is the building. I'm just going to race through these piles of trash, and then here's another one. I'll note that this is the second one that the city did. These two pieces of property are owned by Habitat for Humanity. They're dealing with right now they just don't have the capacity to build enough of these. So they would if they had more money and more time. And that's what I'm currently working on is replacement on these. This is what the building looked like. And so you could talk about the multiplier effect on this. I think some of the national statistics is that it reduces neighboring property costs, not neighboring property value by about 9%. You can see the hole in the roof on this one. That's all asbestos siding too. So Habitat for Humanity saw value after this building was demolished to purchase those two lots and rebuild on them under their model of home ownership. And then those are the pictures. This is another one. I'm picking out some ones that are complicated in title. Again, this is because the banks don't have the tools in their toolbox and near to the DUI. In the meantime, there's no property on this building. This property, the building is gone, but we're now dealing with just waiting for the title. And in the meantime, it'll take a while. So that's what that building looked like. This is one rural development one in this case where we worked well with them through this law. We ended up cleaning up the property, cleaning out the entire interior of the property, and in this case, they actually paid us back quite quickly. Here's another one. This one's currently in the process of being demolished. Again, this one's been sitting vacant in this category for about 4 years. I remember looking at the multiple list service for these, and this was there for the city to look in that state. So it's currently coming down. A lot of machinations later regarding foreclosures and legal process, but nothing that the city's been involved in. So you can generally see it's just open. There's been a number of fires in it. This one's a great success story. We were able to work with rural development, and we were able to actually, in this case, clear the title. We got a release deed, a release to the prior owner of the mortgage. There was two other mortgages that sat on the property. Our lawyer was effective in getting these releases to the prior owner again. And then everything, we put together a quitclaim deed. And in this case, we have very good title on this property. It's now in the city's possession, and we're looking to transfer it and rehab it. And so but if we had a less cumbersome way to do this, we could do it more effectively. And then I'm going to just switch gears here. So now we're getting the environmental pieces, and these are ones that impact liability. This one is an old cleaning facility. That's the crawl space. The EPA injected about $400,000 worth of permanganate into this crawl space area here because this was a former dry cleaner. There was a plume of stuff that went across the street here. This is its current state. During this old time, there were people living in it. This one had 3 units. The property across the street was impacted for a child. I mean, this was the state of the boiler as the inspections were taking place. It's ventilation for the boiler. And this is, currently how it sits, and hopefully this will be gone in the next next week. So I'm now going to bring up and just shift gears just here slightly. This is the tax card on this thing. So you can see the value on it. I'm going to point out here, it's depreciated value 80%, right? And so this is from what I seem to be coming out of the housing economic terms nationally, this would be a qualification of a property that's been fully depreciated, but it produces more in cash flow than it could ever cost and liens. There was a running lien on this. It was in the hands of an LLC. It would basically been abandoned from the LLC's standpoint. Everybody took a big step back regarding liability, yet there were still tenants in here. So that's that property. I wanted to mention, we've got 60 to 70 properties in our vacant building license category, 526, another side story here. We're hopping over into, conversions. We changed our ordinances to encourage accessory dwellings. You're allowed to have an accessory dwelling on any single family residential property throughout the city now, but at the same time, we went through a process where we reduced our single families. There was about 100 two-unit properties that were classified at that, but we're benefiting from that tax classification. Although we're single families, so the land bank has actually cleaned that up. We've brought in additional value because of that, because actually just changing that category to single family increased the value. And then the Gendron lumber, this is just as we hop into more of these more complicated buildings. So these are ones that I would suggest, the state land bank would have some role in. This one is a huge win for the city. This building is now on the ground. And if we didn't have a local land bank and we didn't fight the fight, this property would still be sitting here. It started in 2004 it's blighted status, and it's been that long. So the Land Bank Commission, the City Council, myself were instrumental in making sure this huge fire risk went away. These are some of the pictures from the property. You can see the asbestos flooring. They stripped the copper, left the asbestos sides. Those are all just the way it was currently being used. Here's another one. I'm just going to buzz through these. These are presenting huge environmental liabilities to a local municipality in the end without some state involvement. I'm currently working through how to address this for asbestos, for planning on when it potentially or if it burns. This was its status. We currently have cleaned it up drastically, but are working through some additional others. This is the International Woolen Mill. There's a large environmental contamination here. I was told by an engineer that do not touch that soil there. It's full of cadmium. And then those are how it's currently being used. These are a number of these. I know that these are, I think they're signed for do not contain PCBs. However, they are leaking. And this is thankfully boarded up at this point through the efforts of the land bank. However, it can't stay that way. And Sanford had a very large mill fire in the Stenton Mill. These are some of the pictures that the other side of this building is now demolished. But this is some of the pictures from the interior of that prior to. And I'll leave you all with that picture just to remember here, I think, what we're talking about. And we can talk more about these mill structures when Jim speaks, but I just wanted to say that, I wanted to make sure that it's understood. My perspective is the state should have responsibility for some of these, and I'd like to talk through the structures of how that would take place. I think I'm all done for my presentation. If someone would, you want to grab control from me, I don't know if I have to stop sharing, but I will attempt to do that. So I'm gonna hit the stop sharing button here and hand this right over to George. You ready, George?
I am good to go. Absolutely. I'm just going to go ahead and let's see here. I think I'm going to put this up here. See if I can share a screen first. Probably is the way to go. So I'm going to share this PowerPoint right here. And I'm going to put that in presentation mode, hopefully. Ian, if you can just confirm that you can see.
Yes, I can see it, George.
Super. Thanks, Ann. And I'm going to try and get this up into presentation mode here. It's just, there we go. Okay. All right. And I think we're should be full screen sharing right now on the title slide.
You are good to go, George.
Awesome. Thank you. So my name is George O'Keefe. I'm the Economic Development Director for the town of Rumford. I'm very happy to share what I would describe as our informal approaches to land banking in the town. Ian has a sort of a more formal approach in Sanford through an actual land bank in his municipally based in his city. We have land banking practices in Rumford, and in the discussions that I've had with Ian and Ann throughout this conversation, came to the realization that it was very fair to say that we have local land banking practices, and also we were executing our land banking based on what we had already available. My quick introduction here, I have a BA in history from Catholic University, pretty extensive intelligence background in the US Army. All of my career was in the Maine Army National Guard. Went to Afghanistan twice, some nonprofit work, some development and consulting work, and some quite a bit of graduate coursework. So our informal approach to land banking, we have similar issues to other towns in Maine. We have derelict, dangerous, or abandoned. We have a strong desire to redevelop, and we are using essentially every locally available tool that's already built into existing state law or local ordinances. And that's going pretty good. But we do not have some of the challenges that other towns have, and the next slide is a pretty good example of why. That's our mill. We do not have a shuttered mill, and if we did have a shuttered mill, we would probably be, I think, in a similar position in most other communities in Maine, which is we would have to be dealing with a really big property like this one. We don't have to deal with a big property like this one. We're very thankful for that, but it also, I would just caveat like my entire presentation by saying this is how we're approaching it because we don't have to deal with a gigantic industrial property. So our approach is, again, done without the benefit of a formal policy, but it's actual practice. We take down structures in dangerous buildings. We've done about 30, about half of our dangerous buildings have been through a dangerous buildings proceeding by the town, and about the other half have been through willing owners. We take tax acquired properties. We have had some commercial on that. If you don't have an economic development director in your town, or you don't have an immediate local economic development resource, this approach is very difficult. I have cannot even begin to tell you, or the folks here today on the call, how much time and effort goes into dealing with tax acquired properties when we're not going to tear them down. And so if you don't have somebody who is working for your town, it's really hard to take this approach. But if you can do it, it offers you some very local control. On the tax acquired, we've had some questions come up on environmental. I'll kind of approach those on a case-by-case basis later on in the presentation. And then we also have what I would describe as the Economic Development Reserve, which is a very informal designation, essentially discretionary by the select board. And I wouldn't even just, Economic Development Reserve is like me putting some fancy words onto a policy that the select board adopted for one set of parcels in particular, where they just said, we're just going to hold these back until we have somebody come at us with a good proposal for them or a better use. So that's on tax acquired property. And then in private property, stuff that hasn't gone tax acquired, I have done a fair amount of outreach to private property owners and helped initiate a phase one brownfield grants on 2 separate properties They remain in private hands. They're not about to go tax acquired. They were never at risk of going tax acquired, but they both had issues associated with them. So the first one I'll talk about is Clown Pillsbury. This is a tax acquired property. The rumor in the town was that there was a huge amount of asbestos in this building. And so we were in a position where if we were going to have to pay to figure out how much asbestos was in the building, in order to sort of settle the issue in the minds of the redevelopers that we wanted to sell this building to, or that we wanted to potentially sell this building to, that represented the classic barrier to redevelopment. So I said, all right, that's a barrier to redevelopment. That's the key phrase when it comes to applying for a phase one through, in this case, AVCOG. And a phase one is just a study essentially done by an environmental engineering firm to take a look at a property. And our approach was, we'll do a phase one. We're going to find out how much asbestos there is or is not in the building. And sure enough, they went in, looked at it, and there was very little asbestos. Less than the estimates we've had from contractors who do work in our area, there's less than $10,000 worth of remediation necessary in this building. And we got rid of all of the ghosts and the legends and the rumors about what was or wasn't in this building, and nailed it down to, you have less than $10,000 of remediation, and we're making it a requirement of redevelopment. And when we transition this building to a new owner, they will have to get the asbestos out of there. So that's the Clown Pillsbury building. That is currently owned by the town of Rumford. It has been owned by the town of Rumford for 10 years. And we are definitely in the process of trying to redevelop it. And I think we have one good candidate who responded to the RFP. We'll see how that works out. So Waldo Street, these two triple deckers right here, this is the economic development reserve, if you will. Both of these buildings have been demolished. It's vacant land now. And at some point, either we will reutilize this for like a pocket park. There are actually a lot of children who live across the street from this particular property. There's it's all residential on the other side of the street. So we might do a pocket park. We might do a commercial building. And this, you can't see it from this photo, but this is actually a pretty good location for redevelopment, because the Hannaford is like 300 feet across Lincoln Ave. From this location. So there's a lot of options here. And this is just, the select board is saying we're holding this back until we have the right developer come along or the right opportunity. We do not have a lot of redevelopment pressure on Waldo Street right now. It's a troubled neighborhood, and really not this particular block, not so much from a crime perspective, but just we have a lot of transition going on here, and we're working on it, and we're making progress elsewhere too. Congress and Exchange Street, this is an example of a private property. You can see the vacant lot on the left-hand side of the picture, and then in the photo you can also see Congress Street, which is our central business district and has all of our prime commercial. This intersection is what I describe as the middle of the middle. So this is like absolutely the middle of downtown, and that vacant lot occurred because we had a fire in an existing building. The building then burned down. The building was removed, but some of the debris was buried on site under that dirt. And the building was old enough that there were, again, questions, legends, rumors, myths about how much asbestos there might be there. So we've done a phase one on that, again, at no cost to the town, because it's funded through AVCOG. We were able to make the case that the fact that there's an unknown quantity of asbestos in the debris underneath the soil here represents a barrier to redevelopment. The town makes the application in cooperation and on behalf of the property owner, again, at no cost to the town. We will have, AVCOG is working on this with us. The phase one on that is, I think, at the Maine DEP, the draft phase one. And once that comes through, the next step is probably going to be for authorization of what's called a soil management plan to be put in place, which is a fancy way of saying there's going to be a formal document put into place that will tell or describe that whoever redevelops this is going to just have to use a slab instead of a full foundation for a new building. And and then that will terminate all of the environmental liability under CERCLA. And the same goes for the Clown Pillsbury building. We terminated environmental liability under CERCLA through the phase 1 there, where we will be able to help the private property owner at this vacant lot terminate their environmental liability by going through this phase 1 process at no cost to him and at no cost to the town. So that property now will be a viable candidate for redevelopment in a way that it wasn't 6 months ago. And so we're moving on from there. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't address sort of a more conventional approach, not true land banking, but in some ways it involves a lot of the dynamics that we've talked about here. This also was a brownfield grant from AvCog that dealt with phase 1 and I believe also even phase 2 remediation. And this site now is going to turn into this, which is our Best Western Plus. This is actually under construction right now, and they're getting ready to frame it in within the next 30 to 60 days. The foundation pour is almost complete. And then finally, on the land banking piece, I think I would also be remiss if I didn't discuss the Puya Business Park. Land banking can be, when we talk about environmental issues and properties that are derelict and things that aren't having anything happen with them. The business park is fundamentally a greenfield site, but absolutely nothing was happening with it. You can see some of the piping and the hydrant in the left-hand corner by the road. We had a complete business park that had infrastructure built into it. We had not been able to sell any lots on it. And this is currently under contract to Poland Spring for a bottling plant. I should say under contract as an option. They haven't executed the option, but they have it under option right now. And we are relatively hopeful that that is still looking good. We had to do some regulatory changes, and we also had to have a willingness and a vision on the part of the select board to say, we recognize that this, that this parcel may have been intended for one use as lots, and now we're just going to sell it wholesale. I'm sure most other municipalities would probably consider doing the same thing, but I think in a land banking sense, they held back that property and then are now releasing it in full to a development, and then we'll figure out where to go from there if we're going to have another business park. We've definitely had questions about or thoughts about doing a new industrial park that would focus on providing those kinds of spaces. So that's where I'm leaving off. May not be the right time for questions or not, but and it's back to you. That's how we do it in the town of Rumford.
Yeah. So
Thanks, George. Mandy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. And I'd like to turn it over to Jim. Jim, you out there?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Good morning.
Can we see? Oh, yeah. Okay.
I'm going to make the so hopefully and successfully I'll make the attempt like George did in transitioning over to my screen so that you can see that. Give me just a moment here.
We do have one question for George. George, where will the water come from? Municipal or wells into the aquifer? I believe that's for the...
Yeah, so the water is through the Rumford Water District, and it is, fundamentally coming from the same or similar source as what we get right now. And we, they are Poland Springs, a subordinate in water rights to us. And we feel very comfortable that the arrangement is safe. It's equitable. It provides the necessary protections for the community and for stakeholders. And I think that there are some, I think, understandable concerns and folks who ask very similar kinds of questions. And if I didn't feel comfortable that that this was a fair shake for the town of Rumford, which is, as Ian noted, we both work for the people and we work for the municipality. If I had any concerns whatsoever, I would certainly make them clear. But we have found we found Poland Spring to be very reasonable to work with, and I think also we've been able to successfully create an arrangement that is protecting the people first.
We have one more question, George. Is there interest from private developers / investors to redevelop in Rumford? What kind of incentives is the town providing to entice that private investment?
Yeah, so there is a lot of redevelopment occurring in Rumford. We have had a combination anywhere from out of town, from some Portland area. We've had some regional, and we've had some local. The hotel project is all investors locally who banded together to create an LLC with an investment structure that allowed them to leverage their own assets along with a FAME guarantee, and then conventional financing with a bank partner, and it's public knowledge that that's First National Bank out of Damascata. So there's every level of possible investment activity is taking place. Our primary incentive really is the price of the real estate. Anytime questions about incentives come up, and in particular TIFs, here's the line that I use, and I'll use it for everybody today, and you should know it. We have been forced to choose between feeding our children today and paying for their education tomorrow when it comes to TIFs. And we've had a couple of TIF arrangements that really have been hard on the town, and people feel that they haven't been equitable. So what I'm representing to you right now is what I would describe roughly as the position of the people of the town of Rumford, as I understand it from the town manager and the select board. They really do not want to do more TIFs, and it's incredibly divisive in the community to do TIFs. And I understand that Jim has some approaches on micros and parcel by parcel and so forth. It is destructive to the community conversation right now to bring up TIFs. So the way that we mitigate that is not only A, cheaper real estate, B, very, very reasonable on regulation and code. That doesn't mean we don't have code. We are very good about our life safety code, but we're very understanding about timelines, and we'll stay on you about code, but we know that sometimes you can't do something at the very first moment. And then also, and this is something that some people who've worked with me know that I'm very careful about this, but Rumford does not have any zoning, and we don't like to broadcast that too much. And I just did it right now, but we do not have zoning, and we leverage that fact in our favor as much as possible, and we also have to protect ourselves against possible issues with development or redevelopment that we think is unfavorable to the community or is not what the community wants. So, and then finally, I don't know, Mandy or Ann, if you want me to answer the next question as well.
That would be great. Yeah, if you could just read it out.
Yeah, so Ken's asking in the chat if we created a more formal land bank, would this free up some of your time, or is part of your time directly dedicated to this effort? And he's asking this, he says, as a one-man shop. Okay, so honestly, Ken, I'm not sure that creating a land bank for us would actually free up time, because it would be another committee or board within my town that that I would probably have to work with on a constant basis, where I already do that with the select board and also to the planning board. And the other thing is, we're small enough that if we were going to do this, we would probably have to draw from the same pool of volunteers. So it wouldn't necessarily bring anybody different to the table. So I don't know that creating, this is kind of the difference between me and Ian. On my end, we're a little bit, in fact, not a little bit, a lot smaller than Sanford. I think Sanford's 9,000, 10,000, or well above that.
Yeah,
But I think that, how many? 20?
20,000.
Yeah, exactly. So we're a quarter the size of Sanford, give or take. And, for us, it just is, we have fewer properties to deal with. And we don't, and the big thing is we don't have to deal with a massive mill. that is shut down. So I don't know that it would help, to be honest. I really don't. And so we're kind of middle of the road in terms of, we're not the size of Sanford, but we're also 3 to 4 times larger than most of our surrounding towns. And so we do have to do some very focused economic development work. We can't just sort of try and approach these on a case-by-case basis at the select board level. We do have to actually have an economic development department.
So this is Ian. I would say, I think we started off your presentation, George, there by saying that I really think that that Rumford is already doing land banking, right? So you may not need to change anything that you're doing. And you said, Sanford's doing it very formally. I think the question that we have is, I think there's a couple levels here. It's, how do you turn properties back into reuse? And then how do, we support, that in potentially areas that they may not be large enough, may need to do it at a regional scale, and then addressing some of these, I think you're pretty well along in being able to address some of your mill size structures and sustain those. But I'm just going to ask at this point, it's a good conversation. I'd like Jim to start filling us in here, because I'm hoping he's going to talk about, the importance of a state, level and what that state level agency would bring to the table here. It's and that's from all that we're talking about, and it's it's the idea here isn't a fait accompli. It's to have a discussion. Anything that gets developed here is going to be homegrown, and some ways you can look at this just resources, right? I mean, you can do this now, right? That's what we do in Sanford. That's what Rumford does. It's your self-determination as to whether you do it. How do we just facilitate and make it potentially easier and less time consuming for everybody? So I'll let go there. And can we move on to Jim?
Sure, I'm here. Is the screen visible? The folks can see this big prison site that is in our ownership?
Yep, you're all set, Jim.
Okay, very good. Okay. So I appreciate the time. This has been an excellent conversation. I think my comments are going to start by talking about the role of a state presence in land banking that could play where you all as Mainers wanting to get going down this road. What I alluded to in the last week's discussion was that I actually wanted to talk about tools to approach. So I'm going to get into some conversation about how at least one particular tool, and it is tax increment financing, is a critical component to leverage with land banking for multiple purposes, recognizing the comments that have been made so far and appreciating them. Hopefully some of my graphics are going to show and maybe give you the ability to show your locals why this is why leveraging the tools are so critical. But before we get into that, I want to get to some of these issues of why there's a need for a state role. So sites like this, which may or may not be in your state, but they are in our state, they exist. This former prison site would probably fit the definition of an obsolete property, meaning that it can no longer perform the purpose for which it was intended. And it's a large property. The developed portion of this over on the right side of this slide is a little bit more than 50 acres in size with regards to buildings and structures and infrastructure and wastewater ponds and other, well, the wastewater ponds actually not even shown on that image. It's actually to the north of the site. This perform role as a prison one time, and this is about 120 acres in total size. And this site has a double problem because the state land bank getting control of the property also received an appropriation to engage in the demolition of all those on-site structures that you see there on the left side of the slide. But then during the course of it, and it ostensibly was in position for redevelopment, except for one little caveat, and that was this whole site was a fill site, a landfill site, not trash landfill, but fill site, meaning on over the course of 100 years fill site of stuff. So the need to address this site is about $7 million more than what was originally appropriated by the legislature to do this project. So whether it's a former prison site or whether it's a big fill site or former school sites, the issue is where the state can play a role is by getting control of these sites. It's one of the 5 roles that I am going to present to you today as where the state should have. And that is, again, the big brownfield, the big site that is either owned or was owned by the state or for some reason or other comes in ownership of the state because nobody else wants that property. Last week I discussed presented a environmental liability relative to land banks, and I'm going to take a step back because I was giving you dated information. I was still in my mind thinking about what was the previous language out of CERCLA, which was focused on involuntary acquisition of parcels. And I was corrected actually by one of the listeners last week, a very good conversation, which reminded me that I hadn't changed my slides. In fact, the current language in CERCLA is much more wider than the previous status of involuntary acquisition. This language now, as you see on the slide here, is what's under section 20 sub D, meaning that the term owner operator does not include a unit of government, local government unit, which acquired ownership or control or seizure or otherwise connection with law enforcement or through bankruptcy, tax delinquency, abandonment, or other circumstances in which the government acquires title by its function as sovereign. What this has done, or what this does, these amendments came through with the Build Act of 2018. This opens the palette even further for local governments at any level, state or local government, beyond what was previously considered the tax foreclosure, tax reversion route, and opens it into enforcement by other legal means, which could include anything relative to protecting the public health, safety, and welfare, provided that the governmental entity is functioning through their sovereign power. So that could include, for example, the taking of a property for blight enforcement or blight for other purpose or similar purpose, or for other activity that you might normally think is or normally exercise at a local governmental level. If an acquisition of the property is a necessary function in order to arrest the situation, then it follows that that acquisition as a part of that power seemingly would not endanger a liability to local government. The caveat to that is if the governmental entity is a causation party to the contamination or the situation. And what I don't show you here is the other part of this section, which says, if that's the case, none of this applies to you if you get control of the property. So it's important for you to recognize that the playing field is more conducive to help you in getting at enforcing activity. Now, 2 years ago, the state land bank and the state department, at that time it was Department of Environmental Quality, they've now since changed their name to Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy under the new administration here. But we entered into a memorandum of agreement. The purpose of this slide is to show you that there is a document. If you can read it, good for you. It's a little small print. But what this arrangement that now exists between the state environment, the state land bank, is a more or less a free-flowing back and forth scenario where the environmental department or EGLE, if they get control of a property or need to get control of a property, that they will move that property over to the land bank so that we will hold it in our portfolio for the purpose of supporting whatever immediate mitigation or remedial mitigation, as well as to help position it for future redevelopment whenever or however that redevelopment occurs. And that's another role that a state level land bank role, or a state land bank can play, which is play the role of an environmental repository of these properties. So I've talked about two of them. The other two areas are capacity support to units, either indirect or direct process technical assistance or even funding support. And what our experience has been here is that in many outstate communities where there is simply a lack of budget or personnel or task capacity to perform the role, that through informal or formal arrangement, that the state has agreed and will step in to provide that capacity substitution to help those projects to go. The fifth area where a state land bank role has been played and can be played well is effectively as an agent, a land agent for the state itself or for a larger institution or a local government unit where there's a need to get control of a property. Again, that would be on a probably a case-specific basis. So those are the 5 real areas that we believe that state presence in land banking. And as I understand from Ian's slide identifying the 4 major areas, I think it fills that one section or that one area pretty well. But I want to turn the conversation now to talking about how aligning tools or leveraging tools can work, particularly if there's a land banking mechanism as you currently can do it in Maine, or were there to be the consideration of doing something on a more formalized basis.
Jim, you might be getting to this, but could you elaborate on how liability would be addressed to the state land bank?
If the state land does that relate to agreement with the environmental agency or
sorry, Jim, this is Ian. I was asking if you could elaborate on how would property transfer from a private entity to the state land bank, and during that transfer, how would liability be addressed?
There's a number of scenarios that could avail. I'm going to be generic for the moment in responding, Ian.
That's fine.
If the government or the land bank representing the government is taking jurisdiction in lieu of an enforcement action or as part of an enforcement action, then that land bank entity will likely, in my opinion, fall under the exemption, the liability exemption rule that I just mentioned to you, as it's part of the whole rule power that's being taken care of, being done. In our case, as I was just showing you, I didn't show you the details of our arrangement we have with our state environmental agency, but our agreement, by definition, establishes the land bank as an interim owner. And because of the land bank is by definition an interim owner, that interim status could be 2 days or 20 years, but it's considered to be an interim stage. And provided that there's not a contribution or an exacerbation of contamination on that property, then by operation of that agreement, our environmental agency has defined that the land bank will be exempt from liability. And that language in our MOU is, of course, backed up by Section 20D, as you just saw in that slide. So, and the relationship of that is because the state of Michigan has an MOU with the EPA so that the state can manage surplus sites, non-NPL surplus sites, meaning that they're not actively being managed by the federal government to go. And most states have those MOUs. I believe Maine does as well. So it's a function of delegation of enforcement or programmatic responsibility down to the state and their voluntary cleanup program. So that's perhaps a
thank you. No, that's
discussion.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah. Are there other questions about environmental liability? Before I get into the leveraging? Okay, I'm going to move on. I realize that we got about 20 minutes left. I do want to leave time for Q&A, so I think I'm going to go into just the early phases of this discussion, Mandy, sidebar, we might want to set up another discussion topic or another session to have further conversation. So there's a very delicious linkage between these two concepts: land banking, which focuses on the acquisition or title clearance, if and as necessary or appropriate, and the management and the disposition of property, and tax increment financing as one of a suite of economic development tools which could be utilized for repositioning a site or incenting a site to move through the system. What do I mean by that? In the last week's discussion, we were talking about land banking as an entity which is a bank which holds property. But with many land banks, the experience across the states and the nation has been that properties go into the land bank and they sit in the repository. Ergo, the first version of land banking, or 1.0. In the movement that is growing now, this concept of moving to a 2.0 or a next phase of land banking, the philosophy shift is on finding ways and mechanisms to move the properties progressively through the stage of interim status, dealing with all of the necessary activities, whatever they may be, with the goal and the target always being focused on productive reuse. And so, but reaching that goal needs to have likely incentive, process or financial incentive to get to that goal. Ergo, tax increment financing, or TIF, because it's a financing mechanism that can utilize new value and the tax capture on that to reimburse those costs. That is one of what could be a couple of program tools that could be worked in combination with. But what's common with these two is the focus here on distressed land parcels. Distressed, either physically distressed, meaning they're contaminated, blighted, obsolete, derelict, or even historic resource. And second is that they are also complicated by factors of poor title and the need to get control to move them into interim status to move forward. This is a slide that will be interactive here for you. I've used this for many years, and it is intended to show an audience, such as yourselves, what the reality is of dealing with a site which has distress factors, whether they are physical or whether they are documentary stress factors. My attempt here is to show you a real estate pro forma in a graphic, where that red curve is going to be the cost that a developer or development team or anybody would have to incur in order to take a piece of land or a piece of land with structures on it and successfully move it to productive real estate development use. At some point in time after cost is incurred, revenue, we would assume, would be generated, and to the point and extent that the revenue curve exceeds the cost curve like you have here, that would present the return on investment scenario where investment would occur, the market would function, and returns would be brought back both to the private investment as well as the governmental entity and taxes for public services and the like. But that's a normal situation. On a redevelopment site, be it contaminated, blighted, obsolete, or other factors, documented factors, the combination of normal cost has extraordinary cost added to it. That could be the cost to conduct, as you've heard already, environmental assessments, phase 1, phase 2, to provide your environmental certification and liability, proceed to response activity planning and execution, as well as title clearance and other management, demolition, lead and asbestos abatement, and the other factors, some of them you've heard today. All those amount to extraordinary cost elements on top of what would be the normal real estate investment cost. And as such, taking away any other scenario, all right, this economic certainty on redevelopment sites is often what prohibits these sites from moving anywhere, okay? So the need of the public through the government or other mechanisms is to offset the extraordinary costs. Now, I've focused on TIF here because my intention was going to be to move through talking a little more on TIF to go. But the premise, as you might be familiar from as practice from economic developers, or if you are an economic developer, is that if you can offset, if you can equalize the cost of cover the cost of extraordinary activities, then the redevelopment will happen. But that misses a very key important part, which is this. A redevelopment project is really two projects. There is the regular construction development project, whatever it may be, but all of those extraordinary costs, be them assessment, due care, cleanup, abatement, demolition, those amount to a second project that has to be designed, specified, financed, permitted, and entitled. So to the developer of a redevelopment site, they are looking at two projects, and many of the firms are able to integrate, but no one can integrate successfully both of those projects because of the time cost of money. So the opportune situation would be finding one or more incentives which actually move the cost curve not to be 100% equal, but be just below the normal cost. And the reason for that is because it begins to move the market to make investments on those sites. And that's philosophically a very important point that I want you to understand today, because it gets lost often in the public and in the politics of why projects are being incented. I've heard a little bit about that already today, and I understand and appreciate the concerns that folks have, because there are many, many stories of developers or projects being over-incented to the detriment of the public. But there is a bona fide, legitimate, necessary element that is in here, and it's focused on targeting the project to redevelopment financing, and my opinion is focusing on defining and offsetting the extraordinary costs while requiring the real estate project, the development project, to still maintain itself on the normal costs that would be required as if there were no factors that were distressing the property. We've got about 15 minutes, Mandy. I'm tempted to say we might want to hold off at this moment so that we can take Q&A, because as I start to dive into some of these elements, it's probably going to take us past our 11 o'clock if we were to continue our 11 o'clock time. So I'm looking to see whether you're shaking your head yes or no, that we should, yes. You're saying yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's stop for the moment here. Go back.
We already have a couple of questions / comments.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Cool. Other than TIF, what other financial incentives do you typically see employed to spur redevelopment?
At the state or local level, it could be a flat out tax abatement. It could be a direct financial participation to local unit of government. If it's a state role, it could be a state enabling program to allow for grants or loans as well. Federal programs, the federal formula funding programs, be they the community development block grant program. If it's a residential project, it'd be home. There could be multiple that can often align with each other. The general rule of thumb is that it's usually you cannot leverage two sources out of the same governmental entity, governmental level, and that's not always the case, but generally that's a rule of thumb. So those are just some top of the mind examples of where other sources can come in to combine.
Great. We also have a comment from Stuart, and if Stuart, if you want to unmute yourself, that would be great. He says the cost advantage is also the theory with federal opportunity zones. It increases, quote, normal revenue to include tax deferrals. Thoughts?
Well, if you can get to be a opportunity zone, but that's not what we currently have in the state of Maine.
I'd like to address that.
Sure.
So the town of Rumford is designated as an economic opportunity zone. And I don't know if maybe Ian, maybe if you're referring to something other than that, or if the question was with
Oh, well,
regards to
Sanford
something other than
isn't.
that.
Sanford is not designated, but that's not because we didn't apply and put our attempt to be
Right.
one, and nor, and the same reason do we have the need. So, that's great that Rumford is, and
So,
congratulations.
right. Yeah.
But
It's, yeah. So, the question, Stuart, can you clarify um, increasing, what you mean by increasing quote unquote normal revenue? Because the economic opportunity zone doesn't have any interaction with municipal property taxes directly, unless you're saying because it increases value, we ultimately get more. Yeah, okay, gotcha. Federal zone lowers Fed taxes. That is correct. It lowers taxes on capital gains
Any investors? Okay.
for a transfer of or a sale of one income producing property and then an investment made into the economic opportunity zone. I will note that at this time we have had almost no interest or redevelopment occur as a result of the economic opportunity zone designation. It seems to me that the more urban developers who would have capital gains that they would need to shelter under the economic opportunity zone program are probably not comfortable going so far beyond their normal geography of investment. And so even though Rumford has, I think, very attractive real estate prices and truly very attractive real estate opportunities, prior to this pandemic, we were down to 3.5% unemployment, which is slightly higher than the rest of Maine, but very, very low historically for us. And we had, stuff for sale. It still was not attractive, unfortunately. So I just want people to know that the EOZ has some potential benefit, primarily from the sort of the publicity that it gets you, but we just don't have, I think, projects that are attractive enough to the urban developers.
So this is Ian. I wanted to just bring the conversation back to this slide here. So this is what we've been talking about. I think there's, Jim talked about 3 and 4 on this list, being the State Land Bank Authority and how you might structure a program. I think we've had 2 questions about financing. What other ways can you fund such projects? Potentially opportunity zones, potentially HUD money, potentially CDBG program money, other state money, tax increment financing program. So I think that is covered. I think some of the issues that we have to deal with is sustainability of funding, and then I think I'm just gonna that's the summary here. I look at this and say, okay, do I need anything different in Sanford to be able to do what we do? And the item 2 there is something that we need. We work closely with the banks and banks and mortgage companies, and when they can't address these properties, and neither can we, it presents a problem for both parties. At all parties and the communities in which they're in. So, I look at the enabling legislation. So that's could you potentially put one of these at a regional level? Say that, and I'm not suggesting this, but that for those municipalities that don't have the internal capacity, could they jointly by agreement form a land bank together to address those property tax acquired properties that I think someone had a question about of how do we address those, and then as well addressing these blighted properties, and then finally I see a reason to have a state land bank authority. From my perspective here in Sanford, I say it puts the responsibility where it is. You know, I think you know what Jim has talked about, and why I asked the question about liability there is, you know, how would that liability be addressed over the long term, and then finally, you know, how do you then, once you land bank these, how do you then plan on their rehabilitation? Because, you know, in my mind, and I'm probably impatient, but, you know, having a mill building sit around for 20 years, and then you know, not even Sanford's International Woolen Mill, I keep on asking the question, so when did the mill close? You know, and I'm thinking back in time, you know, when did it really close, and how long that property's been sitting like that in a severe environmental state, where, you know, if it wasn't for the municipality applying for a competitive EPA grant to do some, you know, to pick at it, there would be nothing done until such time that occurred. So those are my comments on that, and I'll leave it.
Well, Ian,
there.
actually, we have another question for you, specifically in Sanford. What percentage of city acquired property would you estimate goes through the land bank?
Well, if you were to include the full, you know, complete program, it's all the rental housing. So, you know, 9% of the tax base. It's all the vacant buildings. So I rattled that off at about 70 properties. And it's about 1,000 properties for rental. So that's that safe, affordable, and decent housing piece. And then as far as the dangerous buildings that we've addressed, we're up to 55 of those. We really take on the worst of the worst. And I'll refer back to my, you know, when I first spoke with Jim O'Keefe in Rumford, it was kind of my aha moment. We just finished working on a demolition, and you know, the auction house said, well, I hear Rumford's doing about a lot of demolitions. So, oh, give them a call, and you know, just finding out that they'd done twice the amount of demolitions than the time that we've been doing it. They'd, you know, been putting money in, you know, through their general fund to support those activities. They've been taking a proactive role in addressing this. And then George says to me, he says, and it's working. So what do you mean it's working? He said, well, you know, we're taking out the worst of the worst. Our sales comps are coming back. So we're, you know, I'll say I can justify it. You know, you can see it in your property value. And then you can see it in your market value. So both ways of assessing a property, you're seeing an improvement in the in the economic advantage for the community. So I think that's a longer way of explaining that, but that's that answer.
Any other questions? It's looking like to know. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would give a few if there's a moment.
Sure.
Yeah, so you know, I think that it's really important for anybody who's looking at how what we're doing in Rumford, also how things are done in Sanford, and then also how things are not being done in towns that are around both of our communities, certainly. That, you know, some places will never have a large mill property to deal with. I certainly hope I never have to deal with it, because if I do, it's all consuming. There's a need, I think, for some of the smaller towns to be able to have access to some of this. I think that there are small towns who probably have no representation on the call today whatsoever, who don't even realize that they could benefit from something like this, and they have significant volumes of smaller commercial properties that in some way, shape, or form are compromised, either environmentally or structurally. And so, you know, my, you know, in discussion with Ian ahead of time, my interest in particular, any kind of a land bank that would occur in entities beyond the town of Rumford, is to help with some of the redevelopment needs and efforts that occur or would occur or could occur in towns around us, that have no economic development resources. They have minimal code enforcement occurring, and in some cases, almost no code enforcement at all, and really need some assistance. I think managing, I think, is one of the key words that got tossed around, managing these problems. And so I see a land bank in Maine, at whatever level it occurs, as being something that will help address not just issues in bigger cities and towns, but also, the small town that is stuck with, a 10,000 square foot commercial property that they just absolutely don't know what to do with. So I think it's important for people to consider the idea that many of us will need, or many of our smaller towns around us may need this more than we do.
Thanks, George. That was really well said.
So with that, I guess we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much to everybody who joined today. Thanks as well to Jim, Ian, and George. We're super thankful for their time. And this has been really, really great. We had over 83 people register and about 60 people on the call. So huge success. Thanks, everyone. We will discuss having another call next. Just, everybody that was on this call, I have your email addresses. If you need to get in touch with us, you can go to www.build-maine.com, and I'll make sure to get out the recording and the slides from this presentation. Thanks so much.